This enchanting vision was made by a kaleidoscope. Here it is, a relatively modern object made in the 1990s. It's rather plain on the outside, though very well made, but inside it's absolutely spellbinding. Most of us will have experienced kaleidoscopes at some point in our childhoods. They've been staple parts of children's experience since the 19th century, when they filled Victorian nurseries alongside rag dolls and rocking horses. Here I have an example of such a thing. It's a very ordinary object and a simple object made of cardboard with printed paper surface. It will have had a print perhaps of Queen Victoria on it at one point. The eyepiece is of turned wood, and the glass at the end is frosted with decorative florets in it to create variety. It is nevertheless an object that has great pretensions to access a world of fantasy and wonder. There's a little band of gold around the edge just to add some magic to it. And it does indeed transport one to worlds of fantasy. One can see the world or feel the world expanding as one looks inside it. Kaleidoscopes were not originally made as toys. They were made by optical instrument makers, sometimes to the highest specifications, and some of them look like scientific instruments. They were certainly not made for rumbustious children. They could be quite delicate and would surely break if they were dropped. This example, for instance, was made by Philip Carpenter. He was an optical instrument maker in Birmingham, and he was selected by the inventor of the kaleidoscope, Sir David Brewster, to be the sole maker of the instrument in its early years. Brewster is sometimes called the father of experimental optics. He was born in 1781 in Scotland, where he lived and worked until his death in 1868. He was especially fascinated by light and how the structures of different materials affected its behaviour as it was reflected off them or refracted through them. He was also a public-spirited person and was principal of the universities of St Andrews and Edinburgh. In his spare time, he wrote popular histories of eminent scientists, edited encyclopedias. He seems to have been the kind of incredibly busy person who can always make time to get more things done. This is a book he wrote on natural magic, giving some impression of the scope of his interest as well as his popular touch. The book is about all kinds of strange optical phenomena explained, a certain amount on mirrors, for instance, other phenomena such as catadioptrical phantasmagoria, issues to do with the experience of seeing. Here, for instance, we have the image of a man who seems to be looking to our right, but when one changes the disposition of his nose and mouth, he looks to our left. Other optical illusions, for instance, the way light behaves, passing through different temperatures of air, causing strange illusions on the horizon. Eskimo ventriloquists. He talks also about what he calls the kaleidophone. A kaleidophone is an object that makes curious patterns in response to sound. The word kaleidoscope means seeing beautiful forms. Kali is beautiful, eyed is form, and scope to see. Here we have a kaleidophone which is hearing beautiful forms. These rods are made to vibrate with lights on their tips, causing patterns in the air as they move.
feats of enormous ingenuity also to cause wonder. So all in keeping with the kaleidoscope, though this actual book doesn't refer to the kaleidoscope itself. Brewster did write a book about the kaleidoscope in 1819. Here's a copy of the third edition, published in 1870, shortly after his death and greatly enlarged. In it, Brewster describes how the idea of the kaleidoscope first occurred to him in 1814. He also described how he developed the instrument, what uses it might have, and what some of its precedents might have been. The first he cites was ascribed to a man called Gian Battista Porta, a Renaissance natural philosopher, who said that if you take two mirrors and join them together like a book, and any object put between them will be seen to multiply, which fascinated him. This idea was taken a step further by the Jesuit polymath Athanasius Kircher in the 17th century, who pointed out that for the illusion to be consistent, then the angles between the mirrors must be exactly divisible into 360 degrees. So for instance, 60, 45 and 30. Here we see his application of Porter's diagram using the device to replicate an image of a garden illuminated by a candle. This idea was taken a step further in 1717 when a garden designer, Richard Bradley, wrote a book called New Improvements in Planting and Gardening, in which he took a design like the one reproduced in Brewster's book and subjected it to the mirror treatment, whereupon it was replicated in the mirrors. And it's true that if one takes a simple design, a relatively random one like this, places it under the mirrors, the pattern is replicated. One can easily imagine designing a garden this way. In fact, many of the gardens produced at this period, at the beginning of the 18th century, and indeed from the Renaissance onwards, could have been produced using mirrors in this way. They are formal and regular, and were often designed to be seen from above, for instance from a high window. Most of Brewster's book was concerned with how kaleidoscopes work and what are the various possible designs that can be developed from the basic principle. The concept is very simple. Here's another early example. This one was made by John Ruthven of Edinburgh. When demand outstripped supply, other makers were licensed to produce them, and Ruthven was one of those. This object is in a very sorry state. It has evidently fallen into the hands of children, but it does demonstrate how the object works. So the innards can be removed, and they show us a couple of things. First of all, that the mirrors have to be held in place to ensure that the angle between them can be divided into 360 degrees exactly to ensure a beautiful rosette. And the other thing is that the back of the glass needs to be blacked to ensure that only the front of the glass reflects, otherwise one would get a double image. So really quite a simple contraption on the inside. The box is fitted with a number of so-called cells, each of which would be held behind a cap here. Some of them were empty, so you could fill them yourself. It's in hopeless condition. Here's a better example by the same maker. This one's in very good condition, and it demonstrates wonder more effectively. It does have a cell on the inside, frosted on one side in order to ensure that nothing from the outside world is seen, and then full of these translucent pieces. And when assembled together, it does give a marvellous vision, a delicate and refined one. Interestingly, these rosettes are consistent with the taste and style of the time. They're reminiscent of the fan designs of the neoclassical architect Robert Adam, and the colours are deep and saturated in keeping with Regency taste. Elsewhere in his book, Brewster expounds on the potential of the kaleidoscope in a design context. Here we see designs for a kaleidoscope in which the mirrors are adjustable. Here they are in their V-shaped form. And at the bottom of the page, he has moved them into a parallel position, operating a screw at the base, and that enables one to see a horizontal band of ornament rather than a rosette, which is suitable for the design of friezes, for instance. And the images that Brewster supplied at the beginning of his book, rather neoclassical in their style too, were precisely to facilitate the development of these motifs in this horizontal way. Another important development was the use of a stand. A maker called Bate produced this distinctive design, and of course the stand enabled the viewer to fix an image and then to transcribe it to paper in order to use it on ceramics or fabric or something of that kind. When the idea of deriving patterns from kaleidoscopes caught on, it became something of a craze, and mounted kaleidoscopes were produced in numerous different types, cheaper and more utilitarian. This is a good example because the central cylinder is fixed and independently rotating cell end was developed. The idea also became very popular in Europe and beyond. This example is German. It's decorated with a Greek key motif. It's neither a scientific instrument nor a toy. It is something in between, rather like a piece of technical apparatus. Kaleidoscopes were all the rage in America. This is part of an American kaleidoscope. It was actually made by a man called Bush, who was an emigrant from Germany. And he was a rope maker originally, producing ropes perhaps for shipping. The ship wheel effect of the cell box may reflect his experience with ropes, and he used microscopes when he arrived in America to examine the fibers of ropes, and while doing that he became fascinated by the technical properties of the machines and started producing his own, and kaleidoscopes too. And they were extremely popular, and he eventually dedicated himself to it. Rather a chunky object, but very effective, sold in their thousands and with a marvellous interior realm. Characteristic of the period, the taste is more Victorian. It is very colourful, rather crammed with detail in a certain sense, and full of curlicues and arabesques. Kaleidoscopes were also wildly popular in France, so they were also ridiculed there. This satirical engraving from about 1820 shows a purveyor of kaleidoscopes with his prospective clients. It celebrates the prodigious marvels of the device, observing that little things can have great effects, but it also comments on how easily distracted people are by trivial things and how superficial and deluded we can be. One gentleman in the centre is so engrossed by his kaleidoscope that he doesn't notice his wife sneaking a kiss with another man. Another is having his pocket picked. It is true that after the initial craze, the novelty of the kaleidoscope did wear off, but like so many new technologies, it spawned a raft of analogies and metaphors. In the 1840s, Karl Marx criticised a fellow socialist, for recycling ideas kaleidoscopically, fruitlessly regurgitating the same idea in ever-changing forms, while seeming to generate new ones. And 10 years later, the art critic John Ruskin berated the use of mechanical means for generating designs with the ease of a kaleidoscope, he said, at the expense of the imagination and creativity. The French poet Charles Baudelaire was more positive. He compared the modern artist to a kaleidoscope, not just to a mirror, which he considered to be an inert reflector, but to what he called a kaleidoscope gifted with consciousness, on account of the artist's ability to transform the fleeting and flickering dazzle of everyday life into a meaningful and coherent representation. The modern artist, he said, is a self with an insatiable appetite for the non-self, at every instant rendering and explaining it in pictures more living than life itself, which is always unstable and fugitive. Of course, the kind of art that Baudelaire's modern artist produced looked nothing like a kaleidoscopic image. That degree of abstraction lay far in the future, but the kaleidoscope did stimulate thoughts that moved in that direction. In fact, Brewster himself touched upon the idea in 1819, perhaps without knowing what he was doing, and he did so by reference to music. He compared the kaleidoscope to an instrument developed by the Jesuit mathematician Louis Bertrand Castel, which Castel called an ocular harpsichord. This marvellous instrument, which sadly no longer survives, operated like a harpsichord, but it presented a carefully scaled sequence of colours rather than sounds when the keys were struck. Castel believed that just as there are intervals in music, so there are in the colour spectrum, and that the primary colours are like fundamental tones. As a result, it should be possible to enjoy sequences of colours and forms as one enjoys music. Brewster picked up on this idea. Colours on their own, he thought, were too static to provide an equivalent experience, and the eye would tire of them. But with the addition of movement, they could provide a new form of artistic experience.
He says himself, with regard to the musical possibilities of the kaleidoscope, to what degree of perfection it may yet arrive, it is not easy to anticipate, but we may venture to predict, because we see the steps by which the prediction is to be fulfilled, that combinations of forms and colours may be made to succeed each other in such a manner as to excite sentiments and ideas with as much vivacity as those which are excited by musical composition. If it be true that there are harmonic colours which inspire more pleasure by their combination than others, that dull and gloomy masses, moving slowly before the eye, excite feelings of sadness and distress, and that the aerial tracery of light and evanescent forms, enriched with lively colours, are capable of inspiring us with cheerfulness and gaiety, then it is unquestionable that by a skilful combination of these passing visions, the mind may derive a degree of pleasure far superior to that which arises from the immediate impression which they make upon the organ of vision. A very simple piece of machinery is alone necessary for introducing objects of different forms and colours, for varying the direction of the motion across the angular aperture, and for accommodating the velocity of their motion to the effect which it is intended to produce.
This thought surely brings us to the very threshold of abstract art. Interestingly, one of the very first artists to produce a completely abstract work, approximately 100 years after Brewster's invention, himself wrote an essay on the kaleidoscope. This was the Russian avant-garde artist Kazimir Malevich, whose essay appeared in 1924. Malevich is best known for his suprematist paintings, which he considered to be the consummation of art history. They are quite literally among the first paintings to have no subject matter. As a result,
Their effect and significance depend entirely on the relationships between their colours and shapes, and consequently they resonate with Brewster's vision of visual music. You would think that Malevich's works cry out to be seen through a kaleidoscope, but this is not the way he saw it. In fact, although rather like Baudelaire, he compared the mind to a kaleidoscope, he worked the analogy in the opposite direction. Whereas Baudelaire had admired the artist's ability to see the random chaos of the world and to capture it coherently in a painting, Malevich mourned the excessive and artificial structures that the mind already imposes on reality, subjecting it to a limited and false understanding and order. And he sought, therefore, to remove what he considered to be the kaleidoscopic lenses of the mind, and to reveal the indeterminate and formless state of reality that pre-exists it.
Malevich's paintings do in fact look rather wonderful when seen through a clear kaleidoscope, as here. And one can also conduct one's own experiments, especially if you have recourse to a so-called designerscope. The designerscope was invented in the 1920s at exactly the same time as Malevich's essay. The makers of it particularly relished the fact that it could make rubbish look beautiful, as you could load it with objects of your own choice. It was also considered to be a wonder of modern art. Nevertheless, Malevich will have surely preferred to see this design in its pre-kaleidoscopic state. In fact, many of his paintings look rather like kaleidoscope cells seen outside the kaleidoscope, not inside it. Kaleidoscope making has undergone something of a revival in recent years, and many different models have been produced by manufacturers all over the world. This is a very good example. It's made by a French company called Après la pluie, after the rain, in about 1990. It is hand painted with an image of two children holding kaleidoscopes and sitting on a moon-like planet surrounded by floating bubbles. It gives something of the impression of the kind of symbolic astronomy that the kaleidoscope represents in itself. It's not that difficult to make kaleidoscopes. In fact, here's one that I made myself. It's a converted perfume bottle with a screw top over the eyepiece. And a very simple construction with a few bits of mother of pearl and other translucent elements in the cell box. So there we are, a brief tour of the inner and outer worlds of the kaleidoscope. I hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for watching.